So let's talk about normal areas to start with. Normal areas contain LSA types 1 through 5. Remember, LSA types 1 and 2 are router and network LSAs, respectively. But what are types 3, 4, and 5? Well, type 3 is the network summary LSA. Despite the name, this LSA is not necessarily a network summary, although it can be. Rather, it simply includes prefixes from other areas, also known as inter-area prefixes. That's INTER. Type 3 summary LSAs are generated by an area border router, or ABR. An ABR is a router that is attached to 2 or more areas. When data traffic moves from one OSPF area to another, inter-area, it passes through an ABR. Again, this is in keeping with that 2-tier hierarchical design. So how does the ABR generate the Type 3 LSA? Well, simply it takes information from Type 1 and Type 2 LSAs and it converts that information into a Type 3 network summary LSA and it sends it to the adjoining areas. In other words, the ABR summarizes the Type 1 and Type 2 LSAs into a Type 3 LSA, hence the term network summary LSA. Now, by the way, Type 3 LSAs stay within an area. Let's look at an example. R2 is an ABR that sits on the edge of areas 0, 23, and 27. R2 is going to take the Type 1 and Type 2 LSAs from area 0 and create a Type 3 network summary LSA, which it will then flood into areas 23 and 27. This way, R3 and R7 do not have to know about the Type 1 and Type 2 LSAs, but they can still learn the prefixes from area 0. Now, we're going to see this in action in the next module when we start configuring OSPF. So that's what an ABR does. But there is another type of router called an Autonomous System Boundary Router, or ASBR. The acronym is similar, but the role is very different. An ASBR is a router that redistributes from another routing protocol into OSPF. Also, when an ASBR generates its Type 1 LSA, it sets a bit called the ASBR bit, which tells everyone else that it is an ASBR. Supposing that R1 redistributes RIP routes into OSPF, R1 is an ASBR. These routes from other routing protocols are called external routes, and ASBRs inject these into the OSPF domain using a Type 5 AS External LSA, AS being the abbreviation for Autonomous System. The Type 5 AS External LSA describes the external prefix and the gateway to reach it. Type 5 LSAs are special in that they are flooded to all normal areas. Unlike LSA types 1, 2, and 3, which stay within an area, Type 5 LSAs are flooded to all normal areas. Now, I mentioned that the Type 5 LSA contains both an external prefix and the gateway needed to reach it. Well, that gateway, or next hop, must be reachable from within the OSPF domain. So the Type 4 ASBR summary LSA tells all OSPF routers about the ASBR that generated the Type 5 LSA. If that doesn't make sense, don't worry, because we're going to look at this in just a moment. We're actually going to configure this. The Type 4 LSA is generated by the ABR bordering the same area the ASBR is in. Now that's probably clear as mud, so let's look at the diagram. Here, R4 is an ASBR that sits on the border of OSPF area 34 and our RIP v2 domain. Now, for the moment, let's assume that area 34 is a normal area, not an NSSA, as the network diagram shows. Assuming that R4 is redistributing RIP routes into OSPF, it would generate a Type 5 AS External LSA. But R3, the ABR, does something as well. Remember I said that the ASBR sets an ASBR bit in its Type 1 LSA. When the ABR, the area border router, which in this case is R3, sees that Type 1 LSA with the ASBR bit set, it knows to create a Type 4 ASBR summary LSA to send to the other areas. In other words, the ABR converts the ASBR's Type 1 LSA into a Type 4 ASBR summary LSA. The reason for this may not be immediately obvious, but just remember, OSPF is meant to be really scalable and efficient. It tries to limit the amount of link state information that it sends to other areas. But in this case, in order for other areas to reach those prefixes, from the RIP routing domain, they have to be able to reach that ASBR. So to sum it up, a Type 4 ASBR summary is generated by an ABR, describes an ASBR, and is flooded to all normal areas. Now you might be wondering, why not just use a Type 3 LSA? Good question. Well, believe it or not, Type 3 and Type 4 LSAs are almost identical, but for technical reasons, which I'm not going to go into in this course, a regular Type 3 LSA is not sufficient to ensure that the ASBR is reachable by all other areas. Before we move on to other area types, in case you're wondering, the backbone area 0 is a normal area. Keep that in mind as we discuss other area types.